Good morning, distinguished participants. It's a privilege to address this conference, and it is in name of our 315 affiliated national trade union organizations, and even more so the 175 million workers they represent in 156 countries, that I can thank the Brazilian government for its initiative to host this third global conference on child labor. I will come back to some of the good reasons why we welcome this initiative and why we in particular welcome this initiative by the Brazilian government. But allow me to first apologize on behalf of my General Secretary, Jeroen Beirnaert, who very much regrets not being able to be here since she's held up in Brussels for our own Executive Bureau and General Council meetings. She nevertheless insisted on addressing all of you personally, and I hope that technology now allows us to have a few minutes of video with a message from her to this conference. Well, maybe I should continue before the video is prepared.
Greetings. I very much regret not being able to be with you at this important event. I congratulate the Brazilian government on hosting this conference because we very much need the scourge of child labour, the issue that we all should be concerned about, to be put back on the policy agenda. When 1 in 10 of our children are actually engaged in labour against any set of principles that we would endorse, when they're not in school, when they're not given the opportunity to have a childhood, to realise the opportunities of education, to build their own secure future, then something's morally wrong. So when you look at the report, which we endorse, then the global labour movement is certainly in favour of increased implementation and enforcement of the minimum age for work. We absolutely call for the support necessary to provide quality public education, access for all children. It's at the heart of both human development and indeed just economic futures. And of course, we want to see the sorts of attention to jobs, jobs and jobs. It means that parents have a chance to get decent work, sustainable jobs with secure incomes that allow them to raise a family with dignity. And for the most vulnerable, social protection, the social protection floor, now endorsed universally, must be funded for the poorest countries. It must be put in place. And I know, as we all appreciate, that the Brazilian government is not only proud of its Bolsa Familia program and other related measures, but is a champion and indeed a mentor of other countries in regard to the social protection floor, and we urge them to continue this work. We do believe that there's a need now to move from the good deeds of the last decade or more and look at a systematic, integrated approach to both public services, to legislative frameworks and compliance, and indeed we urge IPEC and the donors of IPEC to actually look towards how we now drive a framework of implementation where it's expected that the nation will invest in its institutions, in its legal frameworks, and ensure that the world's children have a chance. I congratulate you. I look forward to the outcomes, and you have the absolute commitment of the 175 million members of the International Trade Union Confederation to advance this work in partnership with indeed both government and employers, decent employers who know the value of the fundamental rights that should underpin a just future. Solidarity.
So as I had mentioned earlier, holding this conference to take stock of progress made in the fight against child labor and since the Hague Roadmap is needed and is indeed timely. Much has happened since 2010 and before, and some new developments are certainly worth highlighting as we develop our plans for the future. Major advances have been made, but serious issues remain, and strategies should be adapted and reviewed accordingly. In its most recent report, Marking Progress Against Child Labour, in addition to demonstrating that progress has been far too slow and that the target of 2016 will not be met, the ILO has indeed marked significant progress. But it has also marked differences in speed of progress. It has been far more significant since 2008. The year in which one would expect for progress to stagnate due to the impact of the global financial and economic crisis, and as a consequence, cuts in development aid and donor budgets. One can argue that some of those emerging economies affected by child labor has been less affected by the crisis. But a deeper analysis shows us that the right policy choices are more important than aid or economic growth per se. Sustained progress has been largely due to the right policy choices with regards to education and social protection in the broader framework of the creation of decent work for all. And we want to acknowledge Brazil's role in promoting social protection's floors and the adoption of the related international standard. Earlier this year, the ILO has come up with its first world report on child labor following the Hague Conference, with a focus on social protection. It has provided us with an authoritative document confirming our position that child labor is driven in part by vulnerabilities associated with poverty, risks, and shocks, and that social security is critical to mitigate these vulnerabilities. Brazil, as mentioned by Sharon and many others this morning, is a live example of how increasing social protection and measures to ensure that children go to school through conditional cash transfer systems and programs can indeed be effective. Conditionality in donor funding, however, has always been a serious issue for us in the movement against child labor. In this regard, the acknowledgement in IPEC's 2012 activity report that the initial approach through mainly time-limited programs, which were often not fully incorporated into national legal, fiscal, and institutional frameworks, have not achieved the best results. That was most welcome. This has now been corroborated by further evidence in the September report, and it urgently needs to translate into more systemic and integrated approaches which support the development of effective institutional capacities of governments and public service systems. And this should be acknowledged by the donors community. Donors must share this long-term vision and continue to move away from project support which deals with symptoms of child labor to policy support which tackles the root causes. In the workplace, the two most important areas to focus on are indeed agriculture, still accounting for the vast majority of child labor, as well as the growing share of children in services and manufacturing in the informal economy. Most, if not all, child labor occurs in the informal economy, and therefore we need to work on a transition from informal to a formal economy. If we tolerate the persistence of rights-free and protection-free zones on our labor markets, we are not taking the fight against child labor seriously. Just now in September, the Domestic Workers Convention entered into force. We know that 10.5 million, mainly girls, are in child labor, and 4 out of 5 of those in hazardous work, in domestic work. And the number is bound to be much higher since they are hidden in private households. As a result of a sustained campaign by domestic workers' unions in Brazil, a constitutional amendment was passed unanimously in the Brazilian Senate at the end of March. It formalized the employment of this country of 6.5 million domestic workers, now covered by labor legislation, regulation that now allows monitoring of the sector. In 2011, the UN Human Rights Council endorsed the guiding principles on business and human rights. Finally, we have a clear distinction made between the government's obligation to protect and the business's responsibility to respect human rights, rather than the unhelpful conflation of the two responsibilities which has kept CSR discussions in a deadlock for 2 decades. Brazil has demonstrated its will to transform this soft law framework into effective legal accountability for slavery throughout supply chains in some interesting legislative initiatives on national level and on state level. We very much support these initiatives and hope they will be adopted without dilution. And the last feather on Brazil's cap is a result from this country's willingness to look into the problems of child labor, to research and gather disaggregated statistics to develop its strategies, with significant progress as a result. Research has, for example, allowed this country to better equip and guide its labor inspectorate, including its special mobile inspection group, to the places where it is most needed, an example which should be followed in other countries. But there is also the need for a continued focus on access to education and quality education. The call for efforts to expand access of boys and girls to free, relevant and quality education is of crucial importance. There is a great need to invest in recruiting and educating teachers. In order to meet the Education for All goal by 2015, the world will need an estimated 1.7 million additional primary school teaching positions. We do urge our host to invest more in its teachers and its public education system. Tens of thousands have marched yesterday on the streets of Rio in support of a very long strike, for good reason. Although we firmly dissociate and condemn the anarchist violence which followed the initial peaceful demonstration, we support the strike and the teachers' legitimate demands for higher wages. Teachers must be actively involved in the elaboration of educational policies, as well as entitled to the good working conditions and relevant initial and continued training. Thus, turning over to the role of organized labor in the elimination of child labor. In far too many countries, we are still forced to repeat that freedom of association and the right to organize and collective bargaining are essential to enable us to play our fundamental role in eliminating child labor and to take part in national programs against child labor. Rural workers and workers in education, teachers, in the health sector, workers in social work, and many others have vital knowledge that must be utilized. Trade unions can help directly influence vulnerable families to seek and secure social protection in programs such as the Bolsa Familia, or in my own country, the Ligue des Familles in Belgium. Consolidated strong tripartite partnerships linking workers, employers, and governments in cooperation with civil society will lead to sustained progress towards decent work. To conclude, evidence from past experience throughout the global movement against child labor has demonstrated that the focus now needs to be on all forms of child labor, on policy, social protection, education, social dialogue, a continued focus on agriculture, and a new focus on the informal economy, labor inspection, and due diligence throughout supply chains. In more than one instance, this has been further illustrated by good experience in Brazil. We very much welcome this revitalizing fresh breeze blowing through the anti-child labor movement and related international and national policy. And we hope that the ILO can galvanize this momentum and let this focus continue to drive the fight against child labor in the future. It is along this path that real and sustainable progress has been made and will be made. Let the fight against child labor be one of those areas in which Brazil will demonstrate its emerging geopolitical leadership, and guide the world towards a child labor-free future in cooperation with the ILO. Both certainly do have the full support and commitment of the international trade union movement. Thank you.
Com a palavra, o senhor Octávio Carvajal Bustamante, da Organização Internacional de Empregadores.